Hey, everybody, and thank you for joining us for a webinar on mastering DeFi security, strategy, and lessons from the biggest hacks. Our goal is for everyone to have a whole bunch of different takeaways as we analyze a few of the different hacks of 2022. To get started, my name is David Schwed. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Halborn. Prior to Halborn, I was the Chief Security Officer for Galaxy Digital, and I was also the Global Head of Digital Assets Technology for BNY Mellon. During the course of my presentation, as well as Piotr's, feel free to enter any questions you have directly into the chat window. I'm sorry, not the chat window, the questions and answers, and we'll leave time at the end of each session to address anybody's questions. So I want to dive right into the Axie Infinity Hack. And I always talk about this. If you've ever heard me talk on a panel or give any keynotes, I love talking about this hack. It is generally viewed as, the most sophisticated hack, fortunately in crypto, with $650 million from the Ronin Bridge hack. And the reason I like to talk about it is it focuses really on two different areas. It focuses on social engineering, and it also focuses on just general technical exploits. And while it is a sophisticated attack, and the goal of this portion of the presentation is not necessarily to cause blame or place blame on Sky Mavis or the developers, but it's really to analyze the different threat vectors of how the Lazarus Group was able to effectuate this particular exploits and walk away with the $650 million, and how there were certain things that could have been done architecturally and process that would have prevented the hack on multiple different chains. So we're going to kind of walk through both the social engineering aspect of it and then as well as some of the technical aspects of the hack. So to start off, I want to talk about the social engineering aspect. And this one was very interesting because I think as technologists, we always assume and look at phishing and social engineering attacks as these really evident and glaringly obvious bad attempts to try to get us to, give out our credentials. We'll get this email that says, our Office 365 account is at a disk space, and we'll roll our eyes and click delete or report it. But to really understanding how a sophisticated threat actor will effectuate a social engineering attack, this is one of the better examples to walk through. So if you're not familiar with this aspect of it, and again, this is all an analysis done based on what was reported by Sky Mavis as well as some other security firms, including Halborn. So they started off the attack with a social engineering against the a developer that was working for the organization. So what they did was they created a fake profile on LinkedIn, and they made it look like they were working for a large crypto exchange as a recruiter. So they built this LinkedIn profile. They connected with, I think, hundreds, if not 1,000 people working at this particular crypto exchange, created a work history, got recommendations, was posting online for a certain period of time. So for all intents and purposes, from the outside in, this particular profile looked and felt like a real recruiter working at this exchange. I mean, they were connected to people legitimately working at the exchange organization. So there's really no way to know that this particular profile was not really someone that worked at the exchange. So they reached out via LinkedIn to one of the developers at the organization and said, we are looking to bring somebody in to manage, I think it was manager of engineering. So right there, this was a step up for this individual developer's career. It was working for a large exchange, very reputable. The salary range posted was more than they were making. So they started engaging with this particular profile. And after they were engaged, they then went on interviews. So they actually had, I think, 3 or 5 actual video interviews with different individuals within this organization. And after a couple of weeks, they told them they get back to them. They got back to them. They presented them, on the phone or via the video conference. They presented them with the job offer, including benefits. The person accepted. They sent them a PDF of the job offer so they can open it up and sign it. And that's when that particular developer's machine was exploited. So that entire orchestration of weeks of interviews and communication was all part of this social engineering attack. And while these things are tip, you know, difficult necessarily to predict when they're orchestrated at this kind of a scale, there are certain process and technological controls that you can put in place that maybe would have even stopped that initial exploit. The first one, obviously, is security awareness training. I'm guilty of it, and I'm sure others are as well. We do the click-through security awareness training. They're boring, and we just put them on mute, lower it, because we can all answer the questions because we're all technologists. The first thing I would say is while those computer-based training type of security awareness trainings are absolutely necessary, I would try to make them more interactive, and I would try to bring up real-world examples of these types of social engineering efforts and not just the standard run-of-the-mill computer-based trainings that we typically do. So the first thing is really enhance security awareness training to provide real value and make it interactive with the people that are taking it. The next big thing is, and this is a must, segregation of work and personal devices. So if this particular individual was segregated their work and their personal device, they would have been communicating via LinkedIn on their personal device, and any exploit of that personal device would have severely limited the chances for them to now affect some sort of east or west lateral movement within the organization itself. So that segregation of work and personal devices, while we see it typically absolutely in the Web 2 world, especially where I come from, financial services, there's a clear demarcation between work and personal devices. Things like LinkedIn are blocked because it can be used as a messaging channel, and all messaging needs to be compliant and archived. So when I was working in banks, I was not even able to load up LinkedIn messaging and send messagings to people because it was blocked. So by blocking that personal work environment would have also potentially helped here. And then again, furthering on that, even if you weren't able to segregate work and personal devices, blocking any non-company monitored communication channels would be another avenue to do this. So that's just attacking the social engineering. But now let's just say they got through and they were able to now infect this developer's machines. Then what they did was they did this east or west lateral movement inside to gain access to. This was a 5 of 9 signing for transactions. So they were able to move east or west laterally once they opened that infected PDF to gain access to the keys. So let's walk through what could have been done in that case. So if we took a zero trust architecture, and the zero trust architecture is a big shift fundamentally from where we were thinking about technology, back when I started in technology 20 years ago, where if you're on a local area network, you're considered trusted and you can see all endpoints and all resources. It doesn't necessarily mean you can gain access to it, but you could visibly even just see all of the different resources that are on your network. By taking a zero trust architecture means even if you're sitting on a trusted network, you still, and one endpoint does not necessarily trust another endpoint, and they have to be explicitly given permissions to communicate with them. So in this case, if this was a developer that was VPNing into a network or sitting on the network, even if their machine was owned, there should have been a zero trust architecture. So that east or west lateral movement should have been contained within the laptop itself. Now, moving on, if there was enhanced security operation center monitoring, you could be looking for certain types of anomalies of behavior. Now, again, a lot of this comes down to budget, and we'll touch on that in a second. There's a lot of great tools like CrowdStrike, and there's some open source ones like OSSEC. But the problem is that these are all detective in nature, and there isn't necessarily an incident response security operations center that are acting on these alerts. So we're relying on the preventative nature of these tools. We're not necessarily relying on the detective nature of it and the incident response and the follow-up. And the last piece in this one from the east or west lateral movement is this no developer access to production. And I cannot stress this enough. A lot of organizations, whether it's due to size, whether it's due to efficiency, developers will have this access into production for that quick fix. Let me just go in and change this variable. Let me change this configuration. There needs to be that clear demarcation between a developer, through UAT process, staging, production, your CI/CD, your DevOps, all of that has to be ironclad, because if a developer or one individual who has access to the code can get access to production, they are going to be a potential attack vector. So now moving on, so now we have the centralization of decentralized validators. So I mentioned the 5 of 9 signatures, but one entity had control over 4 signatures. So from the outside, 5 of 9 sounds great. I need 5 different signers before a transaction go through. But if one entity had control over 4 signatures, you're removing some of that decentralization. Now, again, architecturally, you can have these 4 signatures protected maybe in different cloud environments with different access, but realistically, it's going to be one organization. They're not going to go to that lens necessarily to kind of complete completely separate authentication mechanisms or authentication planes and different cloud providers. So you can have one entity that has control over 4 signatures. So you're really reducing it to effectively, you need 2. And then what ended up happening was there was a period of time in which one of the outside validators, or not part of that were owned by Sky Mavis, the Axie DAO, had given permission to Sky Mavis to sign on their behalf due to, I think it was some efficiency issues. So they effectively created an allow list for one of the nodes to be able to sign on behalf. What happened was they never removed that allow list. So again, now if you look at the architectural review, when we look at the 5 of 9 and we realize there's a central point in which one entity controls, that would have been discovered potentially during an architectural review, and that allow list should never have remained after it should have been removed. Now, again, if there was a risk acceptance and a sign off and a date to revisit this and automatic scanning to make sure that the allow list was removed before a ticket can get closed. So this is that mix of process and technology where that allow list could have been removed. Now, again, even if that allow list was removed, they would have only had control over 4 of the keys and would have had to now had effectuate a second hack against another organization. So arguably it may have prevented it. And the last piece was they found the exploit backdoor through a gas-free node. Now, again, I don't know the specifics of this. There wasn't too much released on this, but again, looking at pen testing, security monitoring, looking at defense in depth as far as allowing IP whitelisting. So not just even looking at the contractual layer, looking from an OSI layer, looking at what we can do from a network port layer. Who can communicate with who. If you're using VPC nodes within AWS, there's a lot of network logical segmentation that can go into creating architectures as well in order to stop some backdoors. So now the question is, I brought up budget before. The question is, there are answers to a lot of these, but do they have the budget and the staff to implement those controls? And that's unfortunately a lot of the exploits and a lot of the vulnerabilities that we're seeing in the Web3 world are really due to lack of budget and lack of staff. It isn't necessarily that they don't understand how to build certain things from a secure perspective. It's just that they don't necessarily have the budget that, say, a bank or a large enterprise organization can devote to building out an entire security operations center monitoring team of 15 to 20 people to do 24/7 monitoring. That's an additional 15 to 20 headcount, including including building out the eyes on glass, technical security operations center, follow the sun models, pandemic planning in case there's an outage or an illness in a certain area. Like this is what a typical bank or a large enterprise would do. So they have to make some concessions when they're building out some of these controls. So that's another thing to think about is some of these things could have been prevented, but at what cost? Would the controls have inhibited their ability to scale? I get this a lot from, I don't want to say startup projects, but smaller projects, but even smaller companies is, well, if I start having this segmentation between work and personal devices, am I going to be able to attract and hire talent who don't like working in this type of controlled environment? If I have to get an approval for a privileged access management system every time I need to access the production system, which requires a change management ticket, which has to go to a change advisory board, which needs approval and backup procedures, is that going to inhibit our ability to push out a new feature to our application? Would developers, like I said, and employees want to work in this restricted environment? And the other question that dovetails off of that, like I mentioned, is could they have hired and retained the requisite staff in order to do this? So these are all challenges that we need to look at when we're building out in the Web3 world. So, striking the right balance between security and convenience is always a question of risk appetite. How much risk do you want to take on versus how much convenience do you want to give up versus how much security are you willing to give up, and kind of striking that right balance. So the goal here is really just to identify a couple of different areas to think about. One is understanding that risk profile. What are you trying to protect against? If you're trying to protect against a nation state attack, is effectively stealing bearer assets. I mean, this is a completely different threat model than what we're used to in the Web 2 world, where you steal social security numbers or protected health information, go to the black market and sell them for pennies on the dollar. These are literally robbing vaults and stealing gold. These assets that in and of themselves are worth money, so the risk profile is much higher. We're trying to protect against nation states. So that means our security needs to be a lot higher than what we're used to. We also need to think about prioritizing user experience. Users should be educated to the point that security should feel transparent to the user. There's always this balance of when you start, and again, not just to the user, but also to the employees. So when you start to have certain types of security controls that feel overly onerous on an employee or on a user, that's usually when they try to look for loopholes and how do I get around this process? Like, the easy example that comes to mind, back in the day when people didn't want to walk around with a BlackBerry and their own personal device, when they went to lunch, they would just forward their work emails to their personal device so they wouldn't have to walk around with 2 devices. So that was users circumventing a control because they didn't feel like walking around 2 devices. So you also have to be careful on not being too onerous on security, because that's when people start to look for loopholes. Adaptive security is something that I don't necessarily see prevalent in the Web3 world, but we see it, in the Web2 world. Increasing and decreasing security measures based on risk. Looking at where traffic is coming from, and if traffic looks like it's coming from an area that we haven't necessarily had a communication with, previously, maybe we want to increase the security or put a pause on withdrawal. So starting to think about raising and lowering security measures based on certain factors. Definitely leveraging low friction technologies. biometrics, I have a love-hate relationship with them. I can't change my fingerprints or my eyes, but it also is something that is always with me and that I have. So I wouldn't necessarily rely fully on biometrics, but I would add it to the mix from a factor, third factor, fourth factor. Absolutely use secure enclaves, leverage single sign-on where you can. Again, continuous improvement. Threats evolve as well as technology. So what was good a month or two ago may not be good, 2 months from now. We'll always relook at things through a different lens. We do that at Halborn. We will relook at, some audit reports that we've done in the past based on new vulnerabilities that have been discovered in the wild. Because again, we're always constantly learning. Learn from other industries, and I can't stress this enough. What is Amazon doing? What are banks doing? Look at bank level security and look at the types of controls that they have, the types of hires that they're making, and really learn from them, because not that banks are the gold standard when it comes to security, but they have been doing this a lot longer than the web. And collaboration, there's ISACs being formed. There's different trade groups that are working. So what can we do as a community to really help each other out? And the last thing is, I just wanted to make a quick comparison to the OSI model. The OSI model, if you're not familiar with it on the networking side, is, you have like this different ways of looking at different network traffic at different layers. And each layer, from a security perspective, may have different threat factors. Like if you look at a physical layer in the OSI, I can splice potentially into fiber or into copper, and I can, steal the signal. Or if I'm looking at something at the layer 7 layer, I might be able to, grab certain traffic. So if we start looking at the blockchain in a similar lens, we can start thinking about what are the different threat vectors at the different stages of a blockchain OSI model. Now, again, this isn't necessarily something that is widely adopted as the OSI model, but if we start thinking about, well, what are the types of vectors we can be looking at consensus? What are the type of vectors we could be looking at when we're looking at states, if we're looking at the scalability, if we're just looking at the DApp in general, or even the user utilizing the application? So if we start looking at things through that lens as well and not being so myopically focused on smart contract code, that's the one takeaway that I wish everybody would take is there's so many more vulnerabilities than just smart contracts. Don't just look at doing a smart contract assessment. So that's it. I think we'll turn over to the questions if we have any. Okay, doesn't look like we have any questions. So I am happy to hand it over to Piotr, who's going to do a more technical deep dive into some of the other major hacks like the Poly Network hack, Wormhole, and the Nomad Bridge. So thanks everybody for listening. It looks like there'll just be one more minute for Piotr, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop. So this isn't a question, but more of a comment. The comparison to the OSI model. Yeah, as we're waiting for Piotr, my background, I come from traditional technology and I come from telecommunications. And when I like to look at a threat model, I don't always necessarily like to look at it from like the host. I like to look at it from everywhere. And looking at it from a networking perspective, I think will also kind of give lights into the different types of vulnerabilities that we have in the blockchain world. So here's Piotr, and I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you so much, Dave, and hello and welcome, everyone. My name's Piotr, and I'll have the pleasure of leading the second part of the webinar in which we're going to dive in deeper into the technical details. And I would like to use those slides to help and aid my narrative. So a couple of details on me. I'm a director of security at Halborn. I've been in IT for a couple of years now. Started as a software engineer, then moved on to traditional security, so Web 2 security, and a couple of years back I got interested in blockchain, and here I am, a couple of years now, working full time in blockchain security. So to kick this off, I would like to, so there will be a couple of charts in the presentation. So the first one, I think is most descriptive, because you can see just how much was stolen over those 2 years, and it amounts to more than nominal GDP of a small European country in 2021. And so they've really well covered the Ronin hack, which is currently the biggest one for 624 million. And I would like to start with Poly Network, after which we'll move to Wormhole, and then we'll finish with Nomad Bridge. And so in here, all these hacks which we will cover today are about bridges. So they seem to be the most vulnerable part of the blockchain infrastructure, as of now, at least. So moving on. Starting with Poly Network, which was hacked for over $611 million. There's a slight caveat with the word hacked here, which we will get into in a moment. So a couple of Ethereum virtual machine basics here. So when you have a smart contract, you most likely define a number of functions. And some of these functions can be accessed by either by the external users, meaning you can actually call the functions of this contract, and some functions are unavailable for external access, and so they are just for internal use. Now, the way transactions and function calls are routed in EVM is there's a concept of a function signature, and a function signature is basically the name of the function and a list of comma-separated types of arguments of this function. So if you imagine a function that takes 3 arguments, those arguments have some types and they have some names, so just remove the names and you have the function signature. But that's not quite the end of it, because it would not be technically feasible to do routing by just natural language names. Instead, hash function is used. So in a nutshell, a hash function takes input and produces an output of fixed length that seemingly looks random. So in case of Ethereum, the hashing algorithm used is Kesak 256. And so for every public function, every external function, the function signatures are hashed with this function and then added to the ABI, which serves as an interface to the contract. So whenever we call a contract, a function in a contract, what we're doing under the hood is we're sending the signature, the hashed signature, which is called sig hash, to the contract, and then the contract knows that this particular signature, this particular sig hash corresponds to function XYZ. And if the contract cannot find the function, either a fallback function is executed or execution just fails. So that's quite important for understanding the core, the root case, the root cause of the hack. So let's see what happened to the Poly network. So Poly network was a cross-chain fork of Ethereum. So what that means, it was a slightly modified version of Ethereum that was tasked with connecting different EVM compatible chains. So some of these chains included, BSC, Ethereum, obviously, and Polygon. So a blockchain bridge usually consists of, a set of smart contracts on, one side of the bridge, a set of smart contracts on the second side of the bridge, and some middleware between them. So in this case, the design was quite sophisticated because the design paradigm that was used was a light client type of bridge, because we all have here block header relayers, which means that this intermediate layer can access components and entities that live on other blockchains. And the role of the poly blockchain was to manage the cross-chain communication. So it was almost like a blockchain between other blockchains. So here's a very nice picture that explains how it worked. So we have the source chain, we have the destination chain, we have the poly network chain that serves as the intermediary, and we have relayers that forward data to the poly chain and allow for synchronization of states between the source and destination chains. So here we have the function that is used to execute a function in another contract, in a contract on the other side of the bridge. So the name of the contract is it cross-chain manager, which is quite self-descriptive, and the name of the function is verify header and execute transaction. So we need to provide proof, we need to provide the header, and we need to provide of the data to execute, of course. A part of the data, as we indicated earlier, is the function signature and the actual call data that we want to execute, or at the very least we want to send to the contract. So this particular design was limiting, in a sense, the type of data that or the type of function calls that were supported and that could be executed on the target chain. So as we can see here, the required format was the name of the function, which was entirely user controlled, and then this function expected 2 arguments of type bytes, which is just a vector of bytes, and a third argument, which was unsigned integer 64 length. So here this is how we construct the signature. So we take the hash of the raw signature and we convert it to bytes so that it can be sent to the destination chain. So that seems as a pretty robust security measure, because, well, there's only so much you can do if you have those 3 particular arguments at your disposal. For example, you can't transfer an ERC20 token directly because, well, the signature for the function, the transfer function signature, well, definitely does not look like this. You have to specify the destination, and so the recipient of the tokens and the amount that's going to be transferred. Definitely, we don't need any raw bytes as we have in this example. This contract also, in order to execute a transaction on the destination chain, it's not like anyone can do it, because it's a sensitive contract. It requires particular actors to interact with it, and there are some rules that prohibit unauthenticated and anonymous users from interacting with these contracts. So there's a set of authentication nodes, they're called keepers, and those keepers manage token vaults on every single chain that was supported by the Poly network. So, Polygon had its own token vault, Binance Smart Chain, and Ethereum, of course. So essentially, the TVL of the bridge was spread out and split into as many vaults as were supported, and those vaults were controlled by the keepers, meaning the keepers had full authority over their respective vaults. There is another function that's called, put current epoch connection public key bytes. I think that's what the cryptic names stands for. And with this function, the contract owner can update the keys, the public keys, which can be thought of as identifiers of these vaults. So every vault, every on-chain object is identified by its public key, and so same applies to those nodes, right? Because the nodes can authorize transfers, but in order to do that, the nodes need to have some sort of on-chain identity, and so they have their own public keys. But things happen, keys get compromised, keys get lost. Keys are decommissioned for various reasons, and so the Poly network developers left almost a backdoor that allows the contract owner to change the addresses of these keepers that effectively allow to decommission a keeper and move its role to another node or another object. So the relation between two main contracts here, so ETH cross-chain manager and ETH cross-chain data, is that ETH cross-chain manager manages the data. So here in the data contract, we can change the addresses of the nodes, which makes sense because this is just data. This function here, verify header and execute transaction, that's a part of the ETH cross-chain manager contract. And so let's just keep in mind that for execution, the manager is responsible, and the manager can modify the data contract state. So So how was it even possible to exploit such as multi-layered design? So with functions, with hash functions, there is a certain type of attack called collision. It's not even necessarily an attack; it's more of a property of every single hashing function, and of course the probability of a collision, it depends greatly on what hashing algorithm was used. Now, Ketzak 256 is a quite secure hashing algorithm. However, it's only as secure as the data that's allowed to be input into the hashing function. So just reminding ourselves of the sig hashes. So we have the name of the function followed by the list of arguments, and those fed into the hashing function yield a sig hash, which is used to route the call to the relevant function. So when we also look at the the function that was responsible for changing the identities of the keepers that hold the keys to the vaults, this function here takes a single argument of bytes type, and the way it does it is it just assigns those input bytes to the address to a variable that basically designates the identity of the keeper, of a particular keeper. So back to our hashing functions 101, a collision happens if two different inputs produce the same output with a hashing function. So imagine you're inputting your password to a hashing function, and someone else also inputs their password. And even though your passwords are quite different, in fact, they might be entirely different, there is a certain probability that the hashing function will yield just the very same output. The likelihood is quite low, but it's definitely still there. So this is what happened here. So what the what the attacker exploited. So they were trying time and time again to brute force the method parameter that was passed to the hashing function to arrive at the signature of this function here that was used to update the identities of the keepers. So, it didn't really take much time to find an input that would allow to basically yield the same sig hash that was allowed. And because the signature hash was the same, the signature hash of this method that was called F1121318093 followed by this tuple of 3 parameters. The attacker was trying to find the method parameter value for so long, they managed to find the one that corresponds one-to-one to this function that updates the identities of the nodes. So what happened here is the attacker was able to bypass the validation system without subverting any authorization or authentication controls. They were just brute forcing the method parameter to find the sig hash that corresponds to the identity function. So basically, the aftermath was the attacker was able to overwrite every single keeper identity, and they withdraw all the funds from every single supported chain. So those 699 million tokens were split between those 3 functions. And here's a screenshot of the transactions that some of the transactions that were executed by the attacker. So we can see that we have almost $97 million in a single transaction. So something to food for thought, I guess. But here's when things get interesting, as if they weren't already. what the attacker wanted to do is to send those funds through something that is called a crypto mixer, basically a service that allows to remove any trace of the origins of the transfer. And so, you can't really use a block. Once funds go through a crypto mixer, you can't really trace them back to their origins. Which is used for multiple purposes, unfortunately, by bad actors too. However, while the attackers were smart enough to exploit the network, they didn't really know how to use the mixer service. So here's a note that they left in a transaction for everyone to see. They were literally offering, a reward to someone that can help them, send those funds, those stolen funds, through a crypto mixer. It didn't look. So apparently no one was really willing to help the attackers. So what they did a couple of days back, well, they just returned all the funds. And what's even more interesting is that they did not accept the $500,000 bounty that the Poly team offered just to get the funds back. Now, obviously, that's a fraction of a percentage, considering the entire amount that was stolen, but still quite a handsome reward nevertheless. However, the attackers were not interested in that. So all the money was returned, users were made whole, and the network sort of survived. But it seems like it only happened because of sheer luck rather than attackers feeling guilty about what they've done. Because if they could have done it, if they could have sent the funds through a crypto mixer themselves, now I suppose this slide wouldn't be called happy ending, because definitely the final consequences would be quite different. So that's one bridge that was hacked. Now let's consider something that is that wasn't quite as bad, but still quite bad. So Wormhole, another bridge that was hacked for $326 million, and the previous two hacks were, exploited, or perhaps were targeting, Ethereum and friends, which is often the case in blockchain hacks, because, well, Ethereum is definitely the most commonly used layer one out there, at least for now. Wormhole is slightly different, because while Ethereum was also on one side of the bridge, on the other side we had Solana, a different layer one, entirely different for that matter from Ethereum, and it was a bug in the Solana code that was exploited. That was the ultimate cause of this giant loss to the protocol. So quick introduction to Solana. Its architecture and design solutions are quite different to what we know from Ethereum. And one of the highlights is that Solana splits the execution layer from the data layer. So you can think about it as of a web application, where that web application always stores its data in some sort of a database. And so if you do not have this database plugged into the web application, well, you can't really use it, because you won't be able to authenticate. More than likely won't see any content, because this content is stored on some database somewhere. And theoretically, if you plug in a different database, a database that shows that stores different data, the results and the way you interact with the web application, well, it may change entirely. And this is the case in Solana. So Solana has its own smart contracts, but these smart contracts, unlike Ethereum, they do not store their state. They do not store the data. They just store the code. And the data, well, the data is stored on separate accounts. So these accounts can be called as, building blocks of a database. So, if I plug account A to the program, now I'm gonna get, some results, but if I plug account B instead of account A, assuming B and A are different, well, there's a very good chance I'm going to get different results because there's a different data set the contract is tasked to process. Within a transaction, you can, just like in Ethereum, in one transaction, in one function call, you can actually call multiple contracts and, kind of like simulate multiple transactions. And this is also the case in Solana. And Solana also allows you to basically call multiple contracts within one transaction, and by splitting this interaction into separate instructions within that one transaction. And the last sort of primer on Solana allows for parallel execution. So because we store data separately from the business logic, we can run contracts in parallel as long as they do not reference the same data or they not try to write to the same data, right? Because then we would end up with race conditions on our hands, and well, that's definitely something to avoid. So those are the three prerequisites that we should keep in mind to understand what happened with Wormhole. So Wormhole, again, it was a bridge which allowed you to move, which actually still is in existence, and it allows you to move tokens across multiple networks, and Ethereum and Solana were one of them. And a very common design paradigm in bridges is something called burn mint lock. So essentially what happens is, on one side of the bridge, you lock your assets, and on the other side of the bridge, you're minted a wrapped version of this asset or a synthetic version of this asset. And if you want to, get your original funds back, well, you can just burn your synthetic assets and retrieve your underlying assets on the sort of initial original side of the bridge. So what that means is all synthetic assets are backed one-to-one with real assets, and so they, in theory, are worth exactly the same. Now, it depends, of course, on the smart contracts, other smart contracts to, accept and recognize those synthetic assets, but, on principle, they are backed one-to-one. And so, it's like I had $1 and I had a, synthetic dollar. Now, if I put the dollar in the box and I give you, the synthetic dollar, well, you still have something that's worth $1, right? Because I guarantee that this synthetic assets, it's worth exactly $1. So, the way Wormhole worked is there was a set of nodes called guardians that were watching for events on the source chain and on the destination chain, and if those guardians reach the conclusion that indeed the transaction that's being the cross-chain transaction that's being executed is legitimate, they sign the operation to attest that this is an authorized operation, this is legitimate, and so the funds can be moved securely. And there's so SecP 256K1, that's the Ethereum elliptic curve for those who know Ethereum bits on a lower level. And Solana conveniently has a native support of this function. There's a special smart contract, native smart contract that can verify SecP256K1 signatures. In order for you not to implement this logic yourself, because, well, one, it goes against the #1 rule: don't invent your own crypto, and two, well, it just adds to technical debt. So because in Solana we need to specify all the accounts, all the data that we want to use in a smart contract up front. So when we send the instruction and say, hey, those are the accounts that we're going to use, one of these accounts is called a instruction account. So it's a part of system variables that basically allows any program, any contract that is executing some instructions to see what instructions are within that transaction, right? So if we have 5 instructions within a transaction, in this account we can look up all these instructions, all the data that's being sent, and all the accounts those instructions reference to. To approve, a mint event, and so basically create the creation of the synthetic assets, the Wormhole bridge expected the transaction sender to verify the guardian signatures with the native program. Because in Solana we have access to all the instructions that are processed, and if any of the instructions fail, the whole transaction is reverted. We have the guarantee that if we are at instruction number 5, this means instructions number 1, 2, 3, and 4 were processed successfully, because if they weren't, we wouldn't even make it into instruction number 5. So we know that all the instructions prior to what's processed currently were successfully executed. That's a Solana guarantee. The way it was implemented, there was a particular function that was used to access those instructions. We were able to extract the account in which those instructions were stored. So this function was called load instruction at function. Load instruction at, and this at was the index of the instruction. Now, what the problem was is that this function, it did not check if this is indeed the legitimate system variable account, the legitimate instruction account, the account that allows you to basically look up those instructions. And just to sort of sum it all up, because Solana expects you at any given instruction that all the instructions prior were executed correctly, and the address of the account that allowed you to look up these instructions was in fact incorrect, the attacker was able to create a fake instruction sysvar account in which they faked the signature check. So as far as Wormhole was concerned, everything was good, everything was perfect, and the bridge was free to mint the assets because the signature check passed, and all the other checks passed. Now, unfortunately, they passed only because the instruction sysvar account was forged. So basically what happened is the attacker was able to mint 120,000 of synthetic ether, and they bridged back 75% of that back to Ethereum. So what Wormhole ended up with was just, assets without any backing, meaning they basically lost all these tokens. But fortunately for them, the parent company was able to cover the losses and they refunded the protocol. So we have another bridge to cover left, but we're nearing the end of the webinar. So I would like to stop sharing my screen now and move on to the QA part of the webinar. And for that, I'm going to ask Dave for support.
Okay. All right, so I'm not going to reread the question, but here's the question. It's effectively, does Halborn help out with situations like custody? So the answer is yes. You can look at Halborn as really kind of falling into two different camps. One is on the assurance side, and the other one is on the advisory side. So some of the work that we do from a custodial perspective is we work with certain organizations like some of the globally systemic important banks, the GSIBs, on either helping them evaluate some of the options that are in the market from a qualified custodian perspective. So whether we're looking at, again, not talking about specific engagements, but organizations like a BitGo or a Coinbase or an Anchorage, or if they're looking for a custodial, non-custodial solution like a Fireblocks. We do work with some of the major GSIBs on evaluating whether or not they want to leverage some of that technology. We've also worked with some of the GSIBs that are building some of their own custodial solutions, perhaps leveraging things like Sapier. So the answer to the question is yes, we do work with family offices, hedge funds on evaluating specifically the custodial solutions. Specifically to Fireblocks, we've done some engagements on the protections of the recovery package. From an incident response perspective, like what is the muscle memory to put together that recovery package in order to move funds in the event of potential security event and or outage. So the answer to that question is generally yes for everything that you've mentioned there. We've done some reviews on multi-party computation versus HSMs, combination of the two. So I just need a little bit more detail as to specifically, but the answer generally is yes for that specific question. Okay. Next question is, let me start this one. Okay. So this one is really about framework. So just like web, there are controls such as the NIST 800-53 or the cybersecurity framework. What model do we recommend and that they apply? In addition, are there any types of TTPs for Web3 from MITRE? Is there any similar work to know the techniques, tactics, and procedures used by criminals? And also OWASP published a top 10 vulnerabilities. The answer is yes and no. The answer is there's a lot of work that's being done right now by members of the industry. There's an ISAC that's being formed, a crypto-specific ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center, as well as some consortiums being putting together. There's some work definitely be done by MITRE to put together, but there's nothing established yet like the NIST. There's an organization called the Crypto Consortium that has something called the CCSS standard, which is focused on custodial providers and or service providers in the custodial space that sets out a framework around seed generation, wallet generation. So there's a lot of work that's being done. Unfortunately, there's not like one framework like there is like the NIST cybersecurity framework or 800-53 to point to. And I think that's, it's definitely something that I think the industry needs. And I think, like I said, it's being worked on, but that's, part of the reasons why you would go out and, necessarily hire, specific talent and or leveraging firms, such as Halborn or obviously one of our competitors or a combination of them. That the framework isn't there yet. Piotr, I don't know if you have anything to add specifically on the OAuth side, on the smart contracts specifically.
So currently, something to keep in mind is OWASP top 10 is just, 10 vulnerabilities. And because they're common, you're not really gonna end up finding any of the issues that we covered in the webinar today, just because the most critical ones are within the business logic of the contract. And so, you may call it authorization check, but this authorization check is, buried so deep inside the business logic, it's not equivalent to, sanitizing input for SQL injections. So while this is definitely a valuable source of data, there are more specific write-ups on particular vulnerabilities pertaining to business logic, publicly available either on, in all public reports or, any public reports of our competitors.
And the other thing to realize also is these frameworks are still applicable to Web3. I mean, if you break down what's happening at the end of the day, it's key management. We're signing transactions with public keys and private keys. So it's not anything that's so far differently than what we're doing today. So you can absolutely use the existing frameworks, and just understanding that the threat vectors and attacks are more advanced, and the potential, material impact to an organization is much higher. But things like, you know, least privilege access and segregation of this, and and security monitoring, like all of that stuff is still super relevant. It's just about kind of double clicking into it. So now for talking about protection of a key, you know typically maybe you'd throw it in KMS or use HashiCorp Vault. Now we got to look at, well, what is the access permissions into the VPC that is holding the HashiCorp vaults, and or what are the permissions into AWS for the KMS, or should we be using cloud HSMs, or on-prem HSM? Should we be leveraging MPC? Where is the cryptographic signing happening? Is it in a trusted execution environment? Are we using Intel SGX? Are we using AMD SEV? Are we using confidential compute? Are we using Nitro? So it's not new technology. It's really utilizing existing technologies, and we can obviously borrow from some of the frameworks. So we don't necessarily have to throw everything we've done in the past in the garbage. I would say use it, look at it from a different lens, and perhaps add on additive security controls and look at it from a different lens as far as the material impact to the organization. Someone losing an API key in the Web2 world may not have the same impact of losing your private key, that's actually protecting $50 billion worth of assets. So it's just the types of controls that we're looking at, because most frameworks aren't going to be prescriptive in the sense of this is exactly what you have to do. It's really written in the lens of here are control objectives, and it's up to the organization to figure out what controls do they feel effectively mitigate that risk. So you can still borrow, like I said, 85 to 90% of what's out there, but just looking at it from that revised lens. Okay. And let me answer this question. So in our opinion, the new and rapid development of CBDC, central bank digital currency, can entail a great risk due to poor implementation of the blockchain infrastructure they use. Do we have any information regarding how they are guaranteeing its security? If you look at regulation, when it's, I'm going to pick on the U.S. for a minute, but if you look at how legislation happens in the U.S., you have Congress as are going to pass general guidelines of, it's going to be, responsibility of the Treasury or the OCC or the SEC or the CFTC. And then in between those agencies, they'll set off rules and regulations, and then you'll have the banking examiners or the different type of examining councils will go in. So it's going to follow the same framework that we see today in traditional banking. Now, as far as how are they going to guarantee its security? I think it's the same way they do with traditional banking system, through these checks and controls of requiring organizations to have line 1 risk, line 2 risk, go through internal audits, go through external audits, having banking examiners and regulators come in, kick the tires. There's a lot that goes in to ensure the safety and soundness of our traditional financial markets. So it's really just taking that lens and that construct and lifting it and putting it down into the crypto world. Now, there is going to be a period of time in which there's going to have to be training done with the regulators to help them understand the unique threats and the, like I was talking about before, the additive controls that we'd expect to protect our Web3 infrastructure. But I don't think at the end of the day we're going to see a difference. I think we're just going to see the same types of controls we have for our traditional financial markets, in the CBDC world. Okay, let me stop there. Okay, and then Piotr, I'll turn this one over to you to answer. So let me just start it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Dave. So I've been a dev for some time now, mainly with Rust and Wasm chains. I always love the security aspect, but I'm not quite sure how to jump the field. Any suggestions, and does Halborn provide training? So starting from the end of the question, the answer is we don't provide training directly as of yet. However, we are authors of SANS 554, which is the blockchain security training, which covers and everything from foundations to specifics of the most important chains, with some practical hands-on tasks to solve, starting from generating your wallet and ending at writing an exploit for a Solana smart contract. Well, the way I suppose the best way to start is by reviewing existing public reports. So what blockchain security industry, security service industry is different to the Web2 services, security services industry, is that most of the reports, or perhaps a lot of reports, are made public. And so you have very detailed write-ups on the vulnerabilities, how they were found, how they were exploited, and their specifics. So this is, well, granted, there's a fair bit of research required to find these reports, but there are multiple, GitHub pages where you can just review the links and URLs with all the security services providers. They share their reports. The protocols also advertise their reports because, well, that's some way of ensuring their users that they did what they could to make sure the project is and protocol is secure. Well, definitely this is a valuable resource. There are capture the flag exercises, some of which are available on Halborn's GitHub. Some of our competitors also have them. So that's a good, starting point for learning the practical aspects of security. Once you already have the foundations, once you know what to look for, right? And you can get this knowledge from reading public reports, and there's a lot of them. So you can definitely find valuable knowledge there. I know there's some of the starting points are Ethernaut, damn vulnerable DeFi. So there's plenty. Well, I think also Hack the Box just started shipping some smart contract related exercises. So the training industry is slowly getting there, but for now, this is very decentralized, almost like the blockchain itself. So there's a fair bit of research, but a lot is available. Those are just a couple of topics to explore, and definitely recommend the SEC 554 to get overview of the most important subjects in blockchain security. Not only smart contracts, that's the key point, and I think Dave touched on that a couple of times. Smart contracts are super important, but that's definitely not the entire picture. And for the remaining questions, we will answer them in the comments. So thank you very much for attention. Thanks, Dave, and thanks so much for staying with us.